Maybe you'll start to realize your value again. 9. She avoids unpleasant talks. How many times have you sought to have a serious chat with her, only to be greeted with silence, deflection, or even irritation? You know what I mean. Those occasions when you attempt to open up about something crucial, anything that's been resting heavily on your heart. You approach her with honesty, with vulnerability, maybe even with the sign 10. Self-centeredness. One-sided love isn't love at all. Tiny amount of worry, since relationships are formed on the basis of communication. Correct. But instead of a calm adult talk, you get a change of topic, a hasty walk away, or worse, and fight that somehow swings everything back on you. So now you're stuck, feeling misunderstood, feeling like you're constantly the one who has to modify, but never have the opportunity to speak your thoughts. And every time you bring anything up that's been bugging you, she either shuts down or turns the talk into a war of wills. You end up feeling like you're pleading for attention, for understanding, for connection. You could even start doubting yourself. Is this all in my brain? Is this truly an issue? Or am I just overreaction? But let me tell you, this delaying hard talks doesn't make the issue vanish. It merely creates a wall between you. Now look back to when things were new between you two. The days when you'd stay up late chatting, discussed everything and nothing. Your dreams, her dreams, the anxieties you shared, the small oddities about each other that made you giggle, the profound chats about your past, your future, the what-ifs of life. It felt easy, didn't it? Talking about the difficult topics, knowing that even if you didn't agree on everything, you could still hear each other, still understand one another. Yet somewhere along the road, it faded now. Every time you need to be genuine, every time you try to address something unpleasant, suddenly it seems like you're confronting a wall, and it doesn't end there. When she avoids uncomfortable talks, she's not simply avoiding conflict. She's avoiding connection. She's avoiding the precise thing that establishes a strong partnership, emotional closeness. Marcus Aurelius once remarked, "The hindrance to action enhances progress. What stands in the way becomes the way." But here's the kicker. If every obstacle, whenever your relationship is thrown under the rug, nothing ever really gets fixed, and in the end, those unsolved problems become the one thing that breaks you apart. Let me ask you something personal. When was the last time you felt genuinely heard by her? Not just listened to, not just recognized, but actually heard. When was the last time you brought something significant to the table, and she replied with the same amount of respect, caring, and commitment that you showed her? If you can't recall, if the quiet is louder than the talk itself, then you're being kept in the dark. And here's the sad part. She's not helping you. She's hurting you. Because love isn't about sign 11, a history of betrayal. Past conduct is a major predictor. Avoiding the difficult things. It's about tackling it together. And if she's not prepared to participate in those unpleasant chats, then maybe she's not ready to actually grow with you. She's simply prepared to show up for the simple things, the fluff. But what happens when life throws a curveball? What happens when it's no longer about enjoyable dates, but genuine? Speak about your future, your struggles, your aspirations. That's when you'll know whether she's actually ready to be your partner, or if she's simply keeping you in a cozy zone where nothing ever changes. Remain with me, because the next indication may eventually help you comprehend whether you're creating a future or simply wasting your time. 10. She prioritizes others over you. Have you ever felt that you were merely one of many persons in her life? rather than the most important one. Maybe you've been there, where her friends, her family, or even her work come first, and you're left waiting for bits of her time, attention, and energy. You've attempted to be understanding, tried to be patient, but after a while it begins to sting. You start to know you're not her priority. Maybe it's been like this for a long. Now she'll cancel plans to hang out with her pals. Yet, when you attempt to arrange a great evening for the two of you, she's too busy. Or maybe you've been enthusiastic about spending some quality time together, just the two of you, but then you find out she's gone for a family event, or her pals need her, or work takes her away. Once again, at first you convince yourself it's not a big issue. Life happens. We all get busy. But then the pattern repeats, and the more it occurs, the more you start to wonder, am I not essential enough to be emphasized in her life? Look back to the beginning of your relationship. Recall those first several months when everything was fresh. You couldn't get enough of each other. You'd find time to chat, to be together. Increasing shortage. The cattle also are suffering, their coats matted with frost as they snuggle close in the barn, their breath steaming in the frigid air. As the day drags on, you trek out into the snow to get what firewood you can. It's back-breaking labor, and your hands rapidly get rough and chapped from the cold. But you know that without a fire, your family will not survive. The night you think of your children, their little cheeks pinched with hunger and cold, and you push on. This was the truth for so numerous in medieval times, a continual war against the elements, a fight for survival that dominated every waking hour. And yet, even in the midst of such adversity, there were moments of resilience and even pleasure to be discovered. You see, the medieval world was one highly attuned to the cycles of nature. The changing of the seasons was marked not simply by changes in the weather, but by a complex tapestry of ceremonies and festivals. And so even in the depths of winter, there were glimmers of brightness to be discovered. One such beacon was the mid-winter feast of St. Stephen, held annually year on December 26th. For a little while, the rigorous social hierarchies of medieval society were flipped on its head, with a peasant, or after, been named the ruler of misrule. For the day this blessed man would preside over a raucous celebration replete with food, drink, and revelry, a rare moment of luxury in an otherwise austere life, yet possibly the most lasting emblem of hope in the medieval cold, was the simple act of arriving united in a world where survival sometimes hinged on the strength of one's community. The links of family and relationship took on a deep significance image, if you will, a modest town nestled against the snow. The smoke from the chimneys mingles with the leaden sky, a glimmer of life. Among the bleak landscape inside the cottages, folks huddled together around the fire, exchanging tales and sharing what scant crumbs of food they had. There is a feeling of camaraderie here, a shared feeling of purpose in the face of tragedy. Neighbors struggle through the snow to check on each other, bringing additional fuel or a pot of stew to those in need amid the flickering firelight. Features are creased with exhaustion, but also with a silent resolve. They have survived winters past, and they will endure this one too. And thus, the long frigid months march on, the snow piling higher and the ice becoming thicker with each passing day, because even in the deepest depths of winter, there is a ray of optimism on the horizon for the people of medieval times. No, because no matter how severe the season, spring will come again. They looked for the first indications with a sharp and trained eye, the modest lengthening of the days, the softening of the ground under the snow, And when at finally the thaw started, it was greeted with a pleasure and devotion that we can barely comprehend today. Plough. Monday marked the formal conclusion of the winter season, a day when work in the fields could resume afresh. The ploughs that had sat idle for so length were brought out and anointed in lavish rituals, a sign of the renewed cycle of life. Once the first furrows were carved into the dirt, there was a tangible feeling of relief and appreciation in the air. Life had been hard, indeed, extremely painful at times, but they had lasted through the long dark of winter, through the hunger and the cold and the knowing worry. The people of medieval Europe had clung loyal to the promise of spring. And now, as the country started to thaw, as young buds made their way towards the light that offered was fulfilled. It's a tenacity that is hard to imagine in our current day of convenience and comfort. The prospect of undergoing such unrelenting suffering, year after year, is nearly unfathomable. And yet, there is something incredibly humbling in the knowing that our predecessors accomplished precisely that. They confront the cruel truth of their life with a tenacity and fortitude that is nothing short of amazing. They found hope in the darkest of situations and pleasure in the simplest of things, and in doing so, they bequeathed us a heritage of resilience that reverberate down through the ages. So the next time you feel yourself shivering on a chilly winter's day, take a minute to remember those who came before. Recall their difficulties and their achievements, their pain and their pleasure, and above all, remember the strong human spirit that sustained them through even the harshest of winters, because in the conclusion, that is arguably the biggest lesson we can draw from the medieval era, that no matter how black the night or how cold the wind, the promise of spring is always waiting just around the corner. And with that wonderful listener, we arrive to the conclusion of our voyage through the severe winters of medieval Europe. I hope that these stories of suffering and resilience have given a fresh perspective to your personal experiences of the season. May you always find warmth, taking comfort in the links of family and community, just as our forefathers did so, long past, and may the hope of spring brighten your path through even the coldest of evenings. Thank you for visiting me on this warm nook of history, and recall, if you loved our time together tonight, I'd appreciate it if you'd subscribe and share these stories with a buddy. There are so many more intriguing tales to discover together, but for now, I'll wish you a fond good night. Keep warm, remain safe, and I'll meet you next time for another adventure into the past. Lovely dreams, as the severe circumstances of cold strengthened their icy hold on medieval civilization. Even the most wealthy were not immune to the season's brutal attack. Amid drafty, archaic fortresses, ill-equipped for the 4 months, royal houses had a hard battle in staving off the bitter cold and keeping the court sufficiently equipped. The logistics of sustaining a royal home during winter required nothing short of astonishing huge volumes of firewood needed to be stored to feed the roaring hearths that supplied the sole source of heat. The culinary crew labored endlessly to preserve meats, grains, and vegetables that would support the court through the lengthy, lean months when new fare was scarce. Servitors hurried to seal every crevice, each gap to keep out the creeping frost. Yet even the most thorough precautions frequently proved inadequate, battling winter's unrelenting attack in one especially terrifying story. The medieval queen is reported to have tragically died of exposure behind her own royal walls, according to chroniclers, giving Elizabeth and offer amusing edicts to his betters. Nevertheless, perhaps this act of satin liberty offered a critical pressure valve for the festering emotions and resentments built under the repressive medieval order. The strict distinctions between lord and vassal dissolved for one mirth-filled day when everyone might join as equals in the eating games and carousing the spirit of community produced by such events was more than simple amusement. It was an essential survival strategy, with winter's severity threatening to shatter both body and spirit. The links of camaraderie and kindness created during the Feast of Stephen and similar revelries helped maintain the population through the leanest times. One chronicle from 1377 relates the heartbreaking story of two peasant households whose meager winter provisions had been spent well before springs, coming on the edge of perishing from starvation. They plucked the last of their ragged resources to share a simple dinner on the feast of St. Stephen. That act of kindness and solidarity provided them the ability to survive the season's remaining horrors. Such deeds of compassion constituted the very marrow of medieval civilization. In winter, when a helping hand reached to a frostbitten traveler, or an extra log handed to a shivering widow, might make the difference between life and death. Our common aim of facing winter's attack together shaped a culture of dependency that resisted the era's frequently merciless division. Yet even the hottest displays of conviviality and kindred feeling ultimately chilled as winter's unremitting agony extended on interminably. The Feast of Stephen was simply a little flare of brightness and levity among the frigid darkness, a tiny break before the dreary grind of January, February, and March, when stock's depleted tummies hungered and the cold crept past the most scrupulously stoked fire. The faint hope of distant spring appeared to dissolve into impossible, and yet year after grueling year, medieval society persisted against all obstacles with incredible pain and agony. They clung to life, sustained by the tenacity, fortitude, and brotherhood formed in winter's unsparing crucible. As the country lay asleep and the sun receded, they nevertheless found within themselves the fortitude to continue on. One can only image the rush of tremendous relief and delight that greeted the first tentative hints of winter's departure. The small softening of the chilly air, the progressive lengthening of daylight, the optimistic trickle of icicles succumbing to the sun's strong beams after months of relentless struggling, the sight of the season's earliest failed struggles against the powers of light and life must have looked nothing short of amazing for the battle-weary tillers of the ground. No day was more welcome than plough. Monday, the traditional start of the agricultural year, happening on the first Monday, following Epiphany in early January, it indicated the ground's oncoming thawing and reawakening, albeit the deepest rigors of winter had yet to totally escape their strangling grasp. The customary preparations of plough. Monday supplied a palpable sign of optimism, a guarantee of winter's eventual loosening and spring's return. One may see a mosaic of wrinkled fields gently rising from the fading snows and frosts, the freshly harnessed draft teams bending toward the first tentative overturning of the chilly clouds, with each sod upended to welcome the increasing sun. Medieval man delivered another blow to winter's fading authority and declared his dogged tenacity in the face of nature's caprice. We in the contemporary world, with our central heat and electric blankets, are well-towed larders and robust. You can barely grasp the great endurance necessary to survive the relentless violence of a medieval winter. If the season's impositions appear intimidating to us now, from the comfortable remove, in our temperature-controlled bubbles, how incomprehensible must true winter suffering be. And yet, when we whine about the tiny inconveniences like a delayed trip, with a rain-snarled commute, maybe we would do well to think on the relentless agony endured by our imagine throughout those lengthy, frigid months, what reservoirs of grit and toughness they were compelled to rely upon year after grueling year, merely to survive. Their capacity to eke out moments of joy and togetherness amid such persistent poverty appears virtually superhuman to contemporary sensibilities, that they not only weathered winter's devastation, but managed to discover slivers of light in the all-encompassing darkness, is a monument to the indomitable spirit that slumbers inside us, all ready to be awoken by hardship's trumpet cry. So the next time we feel our contemporary discontents beginning to irritate, maybe we would do well to turn our thoughts back to the chilly plights of our forebears in commemoration of those who came before. Let us seize the chance to draw into our own untapped sources of grit and forbearance, and as we burrow happily into our warm beds, let us give a remembrance for all those who battled winter's hard siege, equipped only with the weapons of will camaraderie and everlasting hope, when the new year dawned and as Monday celebrations faded into memory. Medieval life returned back into its normal winter pattern. Short freezing days and lengthy icy nights were the trademarks of the season. The privileged withdrew to the inadequate warmth of smoky hovels and draughty manors, for the less fortunate cold means a continual war against the elements, only to survive. One of the greatest winter challenges was the ever-present worry of infection in the tight and unclean living circumstances of the period. Sickness may spread like wildfire. The common cold was an unusual discomfort, leaving patients red-nosed and fuzzy-eyed, but much more dangerous ailments also haunted the public. Influenza was a formidable opponent, taking out young and elderly, same with its typical fever chills and pains in an era without vaccinations or effective treatments. Flu. Epidemics might kill whole areas. The winter of 1557 was unusually severe, with a virulent strain of influenza spreading over Europe. In Paris alone, almost 10,000 individuals died. Pneumonia was another sneaky murderer, preying on those weaker by hunger or other diseases. The winter dampness crept into the lungs, causing them to fill with moisture until the victim effectively drowned. Cramped living areas offered the ideal breeding habitat for pneumonia to run wild. It was not uncommon for numerous members of the same family to succumb, leaving orphan children and destroyed lives in its wake. Even royalty was not spared the ravages of winter illness. In reality, disease can spread much more swiftly at castles and courts, owing to the continual movement of people in and out. A visiting dignitary or pilgrim can unwittingly carry pestilence along with their entourage. Henry VIII lost his beloved wife Jane Seymour to postnatal problems, presumably aggravated by the inadequate hygiene standards of the age. Youngsters were possibly the most susceptible of any adverse, weather-meager rations and filthy circumstances combined to make winter a particularly perilous period, for the newborn children born in the chilly months had an extremely dangerous start to life in London. In the 1500s, roughly half of all children did not live to see their 5th birthday. One sad tradition of the period says volumes: the habit of bone. It included tying a black ribbon on the hand of a very sick newborn, should the infant die away. This ribbon might subsequently be used to bind their burial shroud, a mournful reminder of winter's fatal toll on the most innocent, with danger lurking both outside the house and inside. Winter was a time to batten down the hatches and hope for survival. For those with restricted resources, even the simplest amenities of shelter, food, and warmth could not be taken for granted. The frigid grip of winter poverty was merciless and pitiless. Firewood was a valuable commodity with stringent rules. With the collection of fallen logs from forests, a peasant family may cluster over a makeshift fire of dried dung and straw, straining to squeeze out any weak warmth. Trembling cattle shared little heat. They had their breath steaming in the chilly air. Food supplies reduced to a limited diet of salted beef, dehydrated peas, and coarse bread. The full harvest richness was a distant memory, and the first shy greenery of spring was still months away. Searching for winter nourishment required exploring the austere terrain for robust fare like nettles, garlic, and mushrooms. The lack of fresh veggies in winter produced for some rather dismal supper pots. A typical pottage may comprise peas, beans, salty pork, and if fortunate, some foraged greens and wild onions for flavor, bland and tiresome, but adequate to keep body and soul together till spring for many. Even this unpleasant monotony was an impossible luxury. Storms, droughts, pests, and other disasters might annihilate food reserves, throwing whole areas into danger. The Great Famine of 1315 was an especially painful event, caused by unrelenting torrential rains that damaged crops in the fields. Throughout northern Europe, historical reports describe a terrifying scene of desperate people forced to eating dogs, horses, and even human flesh. In their hunger, parents were alleged to have suffocated their famished children as an act of mercy. Corpses littered the streets and fields, too many for suitable burial. Yet this famine was exceptional for its intensity and extent. Regional crop failures and food shortages were an ever-present menace. A medieval winter diet trod a narrow wire between sustenance and hunger. It was a period of hunkering in with the belief that things will soon get worse before they got better beyond minimum survival. Winter influenced every area of medieval life. Leisure, religion, devotion, and even crime and punishment took on the unmistakable imprint of the season. The sheer drudgery of clawing out a living in the brutal cold impacted many parts of life. Socially, winter was a time of pulling in and depending on the relationships of family and community. The joyful meetings around the Ula fire gave way to more solemn pursuits, with travel, hazardous, and daylight-limited individuals went inside for entertainment and enrichment throughout the long dark hours. Telling tales and singing music helped to pass away the hours. The flashing glow of rushlights or tallow candles highlighted images of stitching, weaving, and whittling with idle hands. Considered as the devil's playground, industriousness was more need than that winter's imprisonment at least gave adequate opportunity for such useful occupations, for the literate winter gave an opportunity to cuddle up with a nice book, while this was a very elite club in England at the closing. Around the 15th century, a modest tradesman's library may boast a Bible, a book of Oz, and possibly some merry jests or stories of Robin Hood. Just the affluent could afford the beautifully illustrated books, so treasured by bibliophiles. Those who could read frequently did it aloud for the pleasure and enjoyment of the entire home. Winter was a season for sharing cherished tales about strong knights, canny tricksters, and star-crossed lovers. The Kiowa tales of King Arthur and his court, were constant favorites, their complicated stories and lofty ideas aiming to transcend listeners far beyond the narrow confines of their winter shelter. Fewer healthy entertainments may assist to brighten up the boredom of winter days. Playing with dice was a favorite hobby, frequently leading to heated tempers and empty purses. The clatter of knuckle bones and the rattling of dice would ring out in many a pub and stately hall as fortunes were gained and lost. Alcohol was another typical winter distraction, the fermented pleasures of ale, mead and wine helping to strengthen both body temperature and drinks. Public pubs enjoyed a flourishing trade, giving convivial entertainment and an escape from the severe cold inebriation typically led to looser tongues and lower inhibitions, prompting spirited arguments, bawdy songs, and even a brawl or two. The short, dark days of winter also suited themselves to silent thought and spiritual reflection. The church had considerable power in the medieval psyche, and winter was a time for coming closer to God with agricultural labor. During a lull, more time may be dedicated to prayer, penance, and good actions. The traditional nativity performances and pageants of Christmastide gave way to more serious devotions. As winter intensified, the faithful could conduct pilgrimages to sacred destinations, enduring the severe circumstances as a demonstration of their passion and devotion. Some spent hours in silent churches, fingering rosary beads, frozen with cold, and thinking on their eternity. Soul charity was also a prominent winter virtue, with almsgiving viewed as a Christian responsibility. The 7 acts of physical kindness lay forth a framework for generosity, feeding the hungry, providing water to the thirsty, sheltering the homeless clothing, the naked visiting inmates, nursing the ill, and burying the dead in a season of famine. During adversity, little actions of human compassion might make all the difference. Of course, winter's severity occasionally brought out the worst in human nature as well. Crime tended to grow as desperation set in, and potential for theft increased, with individuals spending more time inside, in close quarters. Tempers frequently flared, leading to a surge in attacks. With other violent crimes, the medieval judicial system was ill-equipped to cope with this seasonal rise in lawlessness. Trials were sometimes postponed until the weather improved, letting the accused to wait in damp and overcrowded prisons. Penalties might be severe, with fines, floggings, and even executions meted out to those found guilty, because even in the face of winter's grim reality, the indomitable human spirit lasted. Individuals sought tiny pleasures and moments of levity, where they could. The distant prospect of spring supported them through the darkest and coldest nights. The longer days of February gave a welcome relief with the feast of St. Valentine on the 14th. This old pagan fertility, rite Christianized into a festival of love, was eagerly accepted by the people of the Middle Ages. It was a bright spark of love and kindness. In the deep center of winter's depths, the tradition of drawing names for Valentine sweethearts was well established by the 15th century. Suitable women and boys would gather to draw slips of paper from a bowl binding their love destiny. For the next year, these yearly couplings sometimes led to festive flirtations and occasionally even weddings. Flowers, sweets, and heartfelt letters were frequent gestures of love given between Valentine sweethearts. The simple act of receiving a handcrafted card from an admirer might send hearts aflutter. Even in the chilliest weather, winter, with all its hardships, could not ice the embers of love. as the feast of St. Valentine passed. Throughout Lent, the austerities of the season deepened, yet there was a feeling that the worst was now past, and happier days lie ahead. The snowdrops and crocuses, peeping their frail heads through the ice, presented clear proof that winter's chilly downpour was finally. Throughout during the Middle Ages, the constant rotation of the seasons influenced every element of existence, and no season made its mark more clearly than winter. It was a period of scarcity and struggle, when just survival was an accomplishment, and yet it was also a moment of tenacity and quiet fortitude in the face of the harshest of elements. Medieval winter was a test of the human soul, a testing ground for the ideals of religion, family, and community. The twinkling icicles, icy meadows, and long fields may have been a picture lovely setting, yet the reality of the season were everything from gorgeous. Nevertheless, this furnace of snow and ice and hunger also created individuals with exceptional fortitude and endurance. The Middle Ages were founded on the backs of those who could weather the absolute worst that winter has to give, and yet find cause to hope for spring. There is arguably no better testament to their obstinate vigor. Thus, the next time you find yourself bemoaning a delayed train or a slippery sidewalk, spare a concern for your medieval forefathers unequipped with warm socks, core heating, or weather applications. They faced each winter as a fight to be waged with every resource at their disposal, and they emerged triumphant spring. Every spring, we are the heirs and benefactors of their tenacity and unshakable soul. And with that, I shall leave you to your cozy bed and electric blankets safe, in the knowledge that winter has been substantially tamed, owing in no little part to those who came before and taught us how it's done. May your dreams be of soft snowfalls and cozy hearths, and may you awoke to a world where winter is more friend than adversary. As the faint winter sun strained to breach the lean, gloomy clouds, the inhabitants of medieval Europe shuddered and pulled their threadbare cloaks closer, grumbling from scant winter diets. Yet today, as the light lingered a little longer in the sky each day, glinting off the melting snow, there was reason for jubilation around the nation. Individuals emerged from their winter cocoons, blinking in the brilliant spring light, bears staggering out from hibernation. Youngsters came out of their houses, relishing at the feel of fresh winds on their cheeks, instead of the searing sting of wintry wind. With exuberant joy, they dashed across the squelching muck, gazing at the first courageous crocuses thrusting their petals through the thawing dirt. Across the fields, farmers excitedly anticipated Plough Monday, the customary start of the every year. Coming on the first Monday following Epiphany, it commemorated the time when the earth had softened sufficiently for ploughing to commence draft horses, and oxen would be attached to ploughs and paraded through the local streets, decked up with garlands. With brilliantly colorful ribbons, church bells rang gleefully as the having passed a joyous start to the blooming season. Ahead, there was a tangible feeling of relief as chimneys blazed with smoke, once more, no longer blocked with snow and ice. The fear of frostbite and disease vanished along with the snowbanks, cheeks furrowed with care from the pressures of winter survival, now crinkled into optimistic grins. Instead, soon colorful spring and summer vegetables would replace the dull preserved graw and hard cheese that had barely carried them through the long dark months. It's probably impossible for us to comprehend from our present vantage point exactly how crucial this seasonal transition was. We may moan about slippery highways, We grumble about losing an hour of sleep to daylight savings time, but for our medieval predecessors, the coming of spring was nothing short of life-affirming. It meant they had endured winter's harsh onslaught, staving off famine and disease. For one more year, the skeleton trees enveloping themselves in green once again was an external indication of the inner rebirth and restoration traditional people felt when warmth and light returned. Some of that joy can still be heard reverberating through the years in bright medieval folk tunes and poems that welcome spring's beautiful return. One English tune, bouncy declared, lute song, cuckoo, groweth said, and bloweth, med, and springeth, the doabu new sing cuckoo, which approximately translates to loudly sing cuckoo. The seed is sprouting, and the meadow is blossoming, and the wood is sprouting up, a new sing cuckoo. The pure, irrepressible delight is obvious flowing out in simple yet intriguing rhyme. So let us take a minute to admire the enormous fortitude, endurance, and joy for life shown by our medieval forebears through the worst hardships possible. They survived making it through each winter by the grit of their teeth and the ties of their communities. And when April brightness and bird singing pierced winter's dreary stillness, at long last they delighted totally, knowing they had once again prevailed over nature's brutality. As we cuddle into our warm beds, possibly complaining half-heartedly about the cold outside our windows, we may spare a thought for those long-ago souls, the ones who would heave breath of utter joy as the snow gave way to mud slinging, raising their shutters and letting the spring air surge in the ones who met winter's cruelty with a resilience and enthusiastic drive to live that should humbling us to this day. Let their bravery be a lesson to us as we confront our own difficult seasons, physically or symbolically. If they could rise from the depths of winter scarcity with such unabashed joy, then surely we too can find wellspring springs of hope to sustain us. The thaw will come, the sun will return, and we shall go out once again into the light voices linked in a booming choir of LWD sing cuckoo. The blizzards and biting frosts continue to torture the country, yet medieval people retained a dogged endurance. Even in the darkest depths of winter, they sought methods to assist one another, withstand the storm neighbors, shared what scant food. Why was the feast of St. Stephen on December 26th a day of rejoicing merriment and wonderfully subversive reversals of fate? By old tradition, a single peasant was anointed the ruler of misrule. On this day, gleefully lording over his bets in a lovely piece of sanctioned revolt, one can only image the raucous peal of laughter that went out as the lowliest serf ordered about the local nobleman with faux imperiousness. For one lovely day, the customary norms and hierarchies fell away, and everyone reveled together as equals. The icy grind of winter appeared to fade, pushed back by the dazzling flare of social delight. Yet soon enough, the joyous pleasures would finish. The misrule would be righted, and the cold, harsh harshness of winter will fall. Once again, the folks would struggle back to their hearths and their tasks, the biting of the wind seeming to mock the ephemeral warmth of thus the war against winter's gloomy siege resumed uninterrupted. And yet even in the bleakest depths of winter, there were quiet deeds of bravery and compassion that thawed the cold from even the most careworn hearts. Neighbors shared scant supplies among others much less fortunate, demonstrating a generosity of soul that no cold could diminish. A certain Dame Matilda of York was said to have once donated her only cloak to a destitute beggar lady, freezing herself through the long trek home. when questioned why she would forsake her one barrier against the terrible cold, she merely smiled serenely and stated, "The warmth of human love is a fire that never goes out." Such selflessness, such dignity of spirit was the hidden weapon with which the medieval people prepared themselves against winter's merciless onslaught. For, while winter may freeze their fingers and toes, it could not harm the invincible summer that showered everlasting in their hearts. And so they survived, they persisted, they prevailed in their own way. Over the toughest of seasons, the first green blossoms of spring were more than simply a pleasant sight. They were a live witness to the tenacity of the human will, the indomitable spirit. It might survive any winter, no matter how dark or chilly, as we nestle further beneath our comfy electric blankets. Maybe we would do well to recall the hardships and successes of our medieval forefathers, for in their constant war against the elements, in their obstinate refusal to yield before nature's unpredictable wrath, they established a legacy of endurance that warms us until today. The bitter winds of winter may still groan outside our windows, but we may gain comfort from the knowledge that if they could withstand the terrible winter with little but a coat and their insatiable human spirit, well, then certainly we can survive till spring comes. Once more, spring at last, when the frigid grip of winter finally started to relax. Medieval people anxiously anticipated the coming of better weather. They had survived months in severe cold, huddling in tight quarters, bellies grumbling from scant winter diets. Yet today, as the light lingered a little longer in the sky each day, glinting off the melting snow, there was reason for jubilation around the nation. Individuals emerged from their winter cocoons, blinking in the brilliant spring light, bears staggering out from hibernation. Youngsters came out of their houses, relishing at the feel of fresh winds on their cheeks, instead of the searing sting of wintry wind. With exuberant joy, they dashed across the squelching muck, gazing at the first courageous crocuses, thrusting their petals through the thawing dirt. Across the fields, farmers excitedly anticipated plow. Monday, the customary start of the every year, coming on the first Monday following Epiphany, it commemorated the time when the earth had softened sufficiently for plowing to commence draft horses, and oxen would be attached to plows and paraded through the local streets, decked up with garlands, with brilliantly colorful ribbons. Church bells rang gleefully as the having passed a joyous start to the blooming season. Ahead, there was a tangible feeling of relief as chimneys blazed with smoke, once more no longer blocked with snow and ice. The fear of frostbite and disease vanished along with the snowbanks, cheeks furrowed with care from the pressures of winter survival, now crinkled into optimistic grins. Instead, soon colorful spring and summer vegetables would replace the dull preserved gruel and hard cheese that had barely carried them through the long, dark months. It's probably impossible for us to comprehend from our present vantage point exactly how crucial this seasonal transition was. We may moan about slippery highways. We grumble about losing an hour of sleep to daylight savings time. But for our medieval predecessors, the coming of spring was nothing short of life-affirming. It meant they had endured winter's harsh onslaught, staving off famine and disease. For one more year, the skeleton trees enveloping themselves in green once again was an external indication of the inner rebirth and restoration traditional people felt when warmth and light returned. Some of that joy can still be heard, reverberating through the years in bright medieval folk tunes and poems that welcome spring's beautiful return. one English tune. Bouncy declared, lute song, cuckoo, groweth said, and bloweth, med, and springeth. The DW new sing cuckoo, which approximately translates to loudly sing cuckoo. The seed is sprouting, and the meadow is blossoming, and the wood is sprouting up, a new sing cuckoo. The pure, irrepressible delight is obvious flowing out in simple yet intriguing rhyme. So let us take a minute to admire the enormous fortitude, endurance, and joy for life shown by our medieval forebears through the worst hardships possible. They survived making it through each winter by the grit of their teeth and the ties of their communities. And when April brightness and bird singing pierced winter's dreary stillness, at long last they delighted totally, knowing they had once again prevailed over nature's brutality. As we cuddle into our warm beds, possibly complaining half-heartedly about the cold, outside our windows, we may spare a thought for those long-ago souls, the ones who would heave breath of utter joy as the snow gave way to mud slinging, raising their shutters and letting the spring air surge, and the ones who met winter's cruelty with a resilience and enthusiastic drive to live that should humbling us to this day. Let their bravery be a lesson to us as we confront our own difficult seasons, physically or symbolically. If they could rise from the depths of winter scarcity with such unabashed joy, then surely we too can find well springs of hope to sustain us. The thaw will come, the sun will return, and we shall go out once again into the light voices linked in a booming choir of LWD sing cuckoo. The blizzards and biting frosts continued to torture the country, yet medieval people retained a dogged endurance. Even in the darkest depths of winter, they sought methods to assist one another, withstand the storm neighbors, shared what scant food they had taken, turns hosting community dinners. Towns allocated young men to check on elderly widows, providing them firewood and mending their dilapidated cottages. One such widow was Agnes, an elderly lady with no relatives to care for her. Her bones ached furiously in the cold, and her hands shook as she sought to start a fire, to no avail. She had almost given up hope when there was a knock at the door. It was Tom, a strapping local boy, whose cheeks red from the cutting wind. He carried not just an armful of wood, but a bag of dried peas and a chunk of salted pork supplied by other residents. Floods of appreciation rushed down Agnes's wrinkled cheeks as Tom fueled a roaring blazing in her fireplace. For the first time in weeks, warmth poured back into her emaciated body. Such gestures of kindness were prevalent in these lean times. The rich and even the nobles were not excluded from compassion. Lady Margaret, wife of the local earl, was recognized for her benevolence. In cold months, despite her castle, larders were adequately provisioned. She insisted on transporting carts of grains and stored foodstuffs to the poorest peasants on her husband's estate. Some of her high-born peers sneered at this, considering the peasants as scarcely better than the cattle. Why spend excellent food on them? Yet Lady Margaret stood loyal to her Christian obligation to care for the less fortunate. One specific winter famine battered the region badly. Lady Margaret labored determinedly to expand the castle supplies, asking the chefs to make substantial soups and stews to hand out to the starved poor who came begging at the gates. The kitchen lads muttered at the additional effort, but the chef, a portly guy called Bernard, shared his mistress's feeling of noblesse oblige. He pushed himself into the work, bulking out the soup with every single turnip and potato in the basement. The voracious peasants greedily slurped it down, careless of the gristly chunks of mutton floating in the dry soup. For others, it would be their sole food for days. If winter dragged on, even Lady Margaret's funds started to run short. She went to surreptitiously selling some of her jewels and finery to obtain more supplies from adjacent towns. Her husband, the Earl, opted to look the other way, appreciating his wife's religiosity, even as he, fearing it would leave them susceptible to hard times. The church also played its role in assisting the suffering monasteries, opened their doors to the destitute and infirm, providing them a cozy pallet of straw to sleep on, with a simple daily supper of bread and ale. Some even established crude clinics to care the frostbitten and dangerously sick. The monks viewed it as their spiritual duty, a method to mimic the selfless kindness of Christ. Brother William was a young novice entrusted with caring to the ill at his monastery's hospital. Amidst the sights and odors of sickness and decay, twisted his stomach. He forced himself to spoon soup into the mouths of toothless elderly and replace the pus-drenched bandages of weeping wounds. He begged hard for the courage to endure this difficulty, and God, that his position in life spared him the greatest ravages of winter, because winter was the great equalizer, laying down rich and poor alike with its frigid scythe. Definitely the affluent could afford thicker woolen hose and pleasures like hot mulled wine, yet they still chilled in their draughty surroundings. They concerned about their winnowing supplies, and death came for them too. In the kind of winter-born sickness, the aristocratic Lady Isabel, was heavily pregnant, amid an especially brutal cold spell, tucked away in her confined cell. She had every luxury, a crackling fire, heaps of furs, and devoted attendants to care to her every need. Yet contagion has a way of getting past even the toughest fortress defenses. A kitchen maid with a hacker cough sent Lady Isabel a posset of warm milk and medicines within days. The expecting mother was burning with fever, her lungs crackling. The infant arrived too soon, a little wisp of a creature that never drew breath by week's end. Lady Isabel, too, was dead. The king himself was not exempt. Henry V, a holy and kind soul, fretted incessantly over the misery of his peasants. During the harsh winter of 1433, the royal doctors ordered him a tonic of cinnamon and ginger to fight off the cold humors. Yet nevertheless, he slipped into a profound despair, unable to thaw his hands, even when shoved practically into the roaring hearth. Some believed it was God's judgment for Henry's frailty as a ruler. In fact, seasonal depression was a disease that may affect any individual, from mightiest monarch to lowliest waves, as the days slowly started to lengthen, and the fiercely clenched hand of winter finally began to soften. They allowed themselves to think about spring. Soon they hoped the land would thaw, and the first tentative buds would grow on the skeleton trees. The huge wheel of the agricultural year might begin to revolve once again in the opening days of spring. On the first Monday following Epiphany, medieval people celebrated Plough. Monday, this was when the first symbolic furrow would be carved from the frost-spangled ground, a hopeful presage of the harvests. To come, village men smeared their faces with soot for luck and marched along the muddy alleyways with their plowshare held high, chanting bawdy tunes to rouse the slumbering earth. Later, there was dancing and substantial meal, and much quaffing of beers. It was a pledge, a commitment that the gloomy days of winter were passing, and brighter tomorrows were ahead. The same everlasting loop played out at all levels of society. In the stately halls of dukes and countesses, minstrels struck up a cheerful melody, and couples erupted into a spirited carol dance, overflowing with the joy of a new year. The king prepared a spectacular feast for his court, the tables loaded with delights like roast swan and March agony sweets. Even the poor peasant Giles and his brood felt a weight removed from their shoulders as they headed out to their simple, the Giles grasping the sack of priceless stored seed that indicated a future. With full bellies, the unhappy widow, Agnes, who had been pounding on death's door, found herself stirring a seething pot of pottage, whistling tunelessly. She had made it through winter's gauntlet to see another spring dawn. Glory be to God. Winter was hard. There was no escape that fact. It brought with it a myriad of afflictions and tribulations, from hunger to bone, numbing cold, to the continual prospect of death and sickness. Yet it was also a moment when the genuine tenacity and community spirit of medieval people shined while peering into the abyss of winter bleakness. They replied with kindness, with fortitude, and even with rebellious delight. They recognized that winter was an inevitable part of the vast cycle of life, and the only way to fight the cold was to bunker down and suffer it together. So as you cuddle under your comfy duvet, maybe whining about the high heating cost, or wiping a piece of ice off your windshield, give a thought for your medieval forefathers. Reflect on how they survived winter after winter in a world before electric blankets, central heating, and supermarket delivery at the push of a button. Though our current winter concerns may seem all-consuming in the time, but pale in compared to what medievals experienced each year, and maybe we might draw a lesson from them, that empathy, compassion, and an irrepressible optimism for spring are the best strategies to endure the adversities life throws our way. Whether it be a polar vortex or a pandemic, let us all embrace the approaching spring with a full and thankful heart, knowing that however deep the snow piles, it will ultimately succumb to the warming sun. The severity of cold simply makes the flowering of spring all the sweeter, and thus, as a medieval monarch could say, let us winter courageously, so that we may spring everlasting. Frost crackles underfoot as you trek through snowdrifts, breath clouding in the frigid air. Icicles glisten with the dim sunshine falling from the eaves of Woolley and Daub cottages. The village sits silent and motionless, hunkered against winter's attack. This is what winter looked like for most of our medieval predecessors, not the comfortable pictures we envisage of festive feasts in warm castles decorated with holly and bursting with music and fun. No, for the great majority, winter was a moment of bone-chilling cold, gnawing hunger, and brutal survival. The prospect of winter starvation was never far away. With crops withering and cattle scarce, putting food on the table became a regular fight. Grain, stocks decreased, and bitter herbs and shriveled turnips were suddenly all that stood between a family and famine. One extremely harsh winter in 1315, a medieval Englishman's crop fell short by a third, owing to storms and severe temperatures. The desperate serfs were forced to chewing the straw roofing off their shelters and scorching the leather off their shoes, all the while still obliged to struggle, for their ambitious, severe malnutrition decreased the body's defenses against winter maladies. The common cold might soon turn into life-threatening pneumonia or bronchitis influenza, cut through communities like a scythe, felling young and old alike as they shivered in their tattered shelters, their teeth chattering. Medieval peasants snuggled close against the weather, crowding into the relative warmth of shuttered dwellings. However, This close-quartered comfort comes at a cost. The stagnant, smoky air, ripe with the stink of unwashed people, decomposing chamber pots, and unclean rushes, was a breeding place for sickness in one 14th century Suffolk household. 13 family members, from grandparents to newborns, in arms, coupled with their skinny hens and mangy dogs, trapped together in a single little smokehouse. All winter. It's fantastic. If any emerged alive come spring. Illness was not the only threat looming amid the long dark evenings. Flames were a continuous concern in crowded wooden cities and communities. One misguided spark might soon develop into a ferocious firestorm, hungrily consuming densely crowded structures and snuffing out life. The Great Fire of London in 1212 began on a cool November night, swiftly racing across the city's tight roads as water froze in the pipes, an estimated 3,000 huddling. Londoners died in the fires, and many more were left homeless. In winter's ice grip, navigation was extremely dangerous in these freezing months. Roadways deteriorated into muddy quagmires as blizzards hid the journey with blinding snowfall. With daylight, limited passengers feared being lost and losing their way, tripping from the walk to a frozen tomb. In 1311, the English Queen Isabella set off from Canterbury for London. As the winter darkness grew, with the shorter day her group missed the path. They walked hopelessly till the early hours as the pregnant queen cried copiously in dread and fatigue. Winter's attack was no less harsh, for working animals, horses and oxmen, became thin and frail on meager winter feed. Their laborious breaths smoked in the frigid air as they lugged wood and loads through knee-deep snow, frostbite blackened extremities and frost-damaged hooves and wheel spokes alike. But even amid the gloomy depths of winter, medieval folk discovered slivers of light. The feast of St. Stephen, or Boxing Day, as we know it now, was a day of compassion and kindness. Alms boxes at churches overflowing with donations for the destitute, while lords served substantial dinners to cold and hungry tenants. The Lord of Misrule. Custom provided a flare of rebellious joy. To the darkest days, a humble peasant jester or deacon would be anointed king and rule over joyful rebels defined by drunkenness role reversals and mischief, a momentary upending of the established order. Despite the privations and perils, medieval winters offered hope. Somehow survived, etched in frigid breaths, and no likely murmured as passionate prayers. Hope that the weak and ill would survive, that food would last until spring, that light and warmth would vanquish the confining cold. Once again, so this winter, when you whine about shoveling the driveway, grumble at the thermostat, or become chilly, waiting for the bus, give a thought for those who come before us. Our medieval forefathers confront the tremendous job of survival, winter after winter, with few of the luxuries we take for granted. Their calm bravery in the face of winter's severity is possibly the biggest lesson they have to offer us. Despite we may never know most of their names or stories, we can comprehend the depth of their trials and find encouragement in their resilience that got them through to brighter days. The severe cold persisted. Its ice downpour, altering the landscape, became a crystalline paradise that would be lovely if not for the great misery it put on the residents. On the land, the snow poured relentlessly from the ash-gray sky, blanketing the countryside amid a stifling white shroud. Icicles dangled like sparkling daggers from the eaves of peasant havels and great ways alike. The hearth of flames that burnt day and night gave just a momentary relief from the biting cold smoke. From the treasured fires, hurt thirsty eyes and strangled lungs in the cramped fated air of WLE and Dorb huts, their gathered bodies packed close for warmth, people and cattle alike, the strong odors of excrement and unclean skin blending together, creating a particularly medieval winter scent for others. However, even this uncertain pleasure was a luxury they could hardly afford. Meager food reserves stretched alarmingly thin, and tummies groaned with the relentless pains of hunger. Many of the poorest subsisted on nothing more than coarse bread and thin gruel, hoping they would live to see the spring. The threat of starvation remained in every dwelling, from poor serf to high lord. None could escape winter's lethal grip, not even those who donned crowns in draughty stone fortress that seemed to absorb the cold and exhale an unyielding damp. Rulers shuddered under mountains of furs. Royal residences needed large quantities of fuel and provender to ride out the long winter months. Woe to the kingdom whose ruler forgot to arrange ahead. According to one tale, a medieval Bohemian princess died from the cold in her bedchamber. Her tragedy, an unsettling reminder that riches and prestige afforded only partial shelter from the elements, but for a peasant family, the death of a loved one, to winter's chilly scythe, was all too regular an event, as brutal as it was predictable sickness, added to the season's huge death toll. Agars and fevers spread like wildfire among populations debilitated by starvation and close quarters. The stale, smoky air of hovels and the pervasive dirt made the lungs more prone to infection. Medieval doctors, their ineffective therapies frequently rely more in mysticism than science could do. Little the roads difficult, with snowdrifts and thick ice, aggravated the winter's troubles. Only the desperate or the brave ventured far from the modest comfort of their houses. In the darkest months, travel for any distance was an agony to be attempted. At one's danger, peddlers' carts lay idle, depriving solitary communities of vital products. Tithes and taxes went uncollected to the vexation of ledgelords and clergy, and woe to the army that had to launch a war over snow-blocked highways, their supply cables stretched to and frayed in the freezing weather. The winter of 1407 witnessed one of the Middle Ages' most astounding military accomplishments derived to this harsh requirement for wintry warfare. The redoubtable Welsh rebel leader, Owain Glyndwr, went combat against the stronger armies of future King Henry V. In the high mountain passes, Glyndwr's warriors, used to tough circumstances, led the English into a trap among the blinding snowstorm. Helpless in their heavy armor, the English lines broke and fled, with many perishing from exposure. Glyndwr's astounding win won as much by the cold as by Welsh martial skill goes on in folklore. To this day, the winters of medieval Europe were frequently distinguished by terrible famines that took countless lives when the cold persisted and spring planting was delayed. Food shortages rapidly followed the tragic global famine of 1315 to 1317, was began by an abnormally wet and frigid spring that deteriorated seedlings in the ground. Consecutive crop failures over the following 2 years put most of the continent into famine. In England, the price of bread increased to 20 times. The typical cost, the destitute resorted to eating grass roots, even the bark off trees, desperate bands. Many scavengers dug into tombs to eat the deceased. It's estimated approximately 25% of the population of cities like Ypres and Bruges in modern-day Belgium died in the French town of Trèves. A gentleman noted in his notebook that the impoverished were eating dogs, horses, and other dirty items. The agony was worsened by crime and sickness, as famished inhabitants resorted to robbery and violence to live one heart-rending tale from the St. Mary's Abbey Chronicles narrates the destiny of a famished lady imprisoned for stealing a loaf of food. The woman was pregnant and famished, but the baker would give her no bread, so she stole a bread and was discovered. The court would not forgive her. Therefore, she was hung. As she died, the baby dropped from her womb before the eyes of the people. The infant lay wounded and wailing on the ground, but no one wanted to approach or rescue it, and the baby soon died where it dropped. The starvation eventually alleviated in 1318 when the weather became favorable again and crops started to thrive. Yet the ghost of famine followed the land every winter, preparing to deliver a dismal harvest at the tiniest difficulty. For medieval folks, cold was always a moment of gnawing discomfort, if not plain panic, as they prayed their inadequate food reserves would last until spring. Hunger weakened the inhabitants and leaving them prone to sickness. The cramped, unclean living conditions during winter led to frequent outbreaks of diseases, including influenza dysentery and pneumonia. Respiratory ailments notably took a terrible toll caused by coughing in filthy, smoky air as individuals crowded around flames. Anything as simple as a winter cold might suddenly become dangerous. In the Middle Ages, even the physicians of the times were of little aid, depending on questionable procedures include bleeding and purging with laxatives to restore the equilibrium of a patient's humors. The Emperor Charlemagne reputedly died of pleurisy in the severe winter of 814 after his physicians treated him with puces and unguents to no avail. Numerous historians say the Black Disease of the 14th century spread so swiftly because famished individuals packed together in winter quarters had no protection to the plague. The 1348 to 1349 pandemic killed a startling 30 to 60% of Europe's population. One tragic narrative comes from Pistoia, Italy, where a guy called Sir Luca wrote to his brother Franceschino, portraying the catastrophe. "I am sick at heart and can scarcely force myself to write for things. Here, go from terrible to worse. Many are dead, and many more are dying. Stores are closed, pubs desolate. One walks along streets without encountering a person. Oceans of sadness resound from places where death has struck. The odor of decay rises from numerous graves. I dread our city may soon be bereft of life. Totally. I beseech you, remain where you are and pray for us unceasingly." When the epidemic raged, whole towns were wiped away. The pain was worsened by the anguish of hurried mass burials in freezing ground and ill individuals banished to die alone in the snow because fear of infection. The horrific losses of the Black Death left severe psychological wounds and irrevocably ruined the medieval world. Winter was a particularly dreadful period for the elderly young children and expecting moms without the advantages. Without modern treatment, these susceptible groups regularly died to cold illness or malnourishment. It's believed that in certain medieval communities, up to 20 to 30%, many newborns perished during their first year of life. Many during the hard winter months, difficulties of pregnancy and childbirth, aggravated by poor nutrition and cold weather, claimed the lives of numerous moms and newborns. The risks of winter childbirth are depicted by the tragic tragedy of Matilda, the 12-year-old daughter of King Henry VI of England. In the winter of 1120, Matilda was on board a ship named the White Ship, traveling from France to England. The ship struck a rock and immediately sunk, sending Matilda and hundreds of other passengers into the freezing waters of the English Channel. Matilda almost averted drowning by got onto a tiny rescue boat, but then called out for her half-brother William, who was still in the ocean, while the boat sailed back to retrieve William. So many desperate people sought to jump on that it capsized, tossing Matilda back into the frigid seas. The king's young daughter, pregnant with her first kid, died, along with the others. Her grief-stricken father was believed to have dropped dead away at the news and never grinned again. For the rest of his life, the extremely elderly and very young were always at jeopardy during the cold winters of the Middle Ages. If they managed to escape sickness and famine, they yet could freeze to death in their sleep. The medieval ballad Sergen and the Green Knight gives a frightening, no pun intended portrayal of the aging King Arthur trembling under his robes in a draughty castle hall, so frigid his teeth chattered as he talked without the insulating ice covers and glaciers we have today. Winters in the Middle Ages were marked by violent snowstorms and destructive floods. In 1216, King John of England reputedly lost the royal jewels while crossing a marshy location in East Anglia called the Wash, escaping foes. In revolt, opposing his reign, John's luggage train was swallowed up by a rising high wave pushed up by severe gales. The king reputedly escaped by the skin of his teeth, but his loot includes beautiful jeweled crowns and scepters went beneath the swirling seas, never to be seen again. John died of dysentery a few days later, a shattered man. Some historians view the loss of the crown jewels was the last blow that took an ill John to his tomb. Cold storms frequently spelled tragedy for coastal areas pummeled by hurricane-force winds and large seas. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle describes a devastating flood that ravaged England in 1099 on St. Martin's Day. The 11th of November came a large sea surge along the length of this country and overran it so far as no one knew that it ever did before, and flooded numerous villages and a huge number of people. Another North Sea flood on January 16th, 1219, fully inundated the low-lying Netherlands, killing over 50,000 humans in a period with no early warning systems or emergency shelters. The people was fully at the whim of the weather. All medieval folk could do was pray for salvation. When freezing floods swelled and the wind howled like the very hounds of hell outside their flimsy houses, severe winters also prompted a rise in flames, as people did all they could to stay warm. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle again delivers a frightening story of a tragic London wildfire. In 1132, a horrible fire broke out on London Bridge and spread so swiftly that before it could be quenched, it burnt out a big section of the city, including the principal church of St. Paul and the Cathedral of Canterbury, alongside many other churches and buildings. The power of the wind and the intensity of the flames dragged blazing beams and sheets of lead from the roofs an astonishing distance, with most structures built of wood and densely squeezed together. It's little surprise medieval towns were such temper traps. The wayward spark. Candle might spark an uncontrollable inferno, particularly with gale force. Cold winds drove the flames into a fury. People ran through narrow, winding streets as their houses burnt behind them, frequently with nothing more than the cloths on their backs. There are innumerable, heartbreaking instances of families split amid the pandemonium, children trampled, and individuals trapped and burnt alive. Given the poor firefighting capabilities of the times, often all citizens could do was throw buckets of water or snow on the flames and hope the wind would change. before the whole city torched, the destruction might be almost complete, leaving people homeless and hungry in the thick of winter. But arguably, the greatest risk of medieval winter was one that needed no tremendous blizzards, floods, or conflagrations. Sometimes the basic, inexorable, life-sucking cold was enough. It's hard for us to fathom in our contemporary age of central heating and thermal materials, but the bone-freezing damp and persistent gloom of winter was a foe against which there was no resistance in the Middle Ages, with only smoky fireplaces and bundles of furs to fight off the harsh winter cold sunk deep into the bones of medieval folk. Arthritis and rheumatism were common ailments. The ache gets worse. With every passing year, extremities progressively grew numb, then black with frostbite, pneumonia, and influenza ran wild in close quarters. The cold seemed to sink into the very soul, sapping all vigor and life. The 6th century British monk Coldest offers a dismal picture. In his essay on the downfall of Britain, the nights are long and dark, the days dismal and frigid. The air stings with malice. The frigid gusts pierce to the bone. Everything is shrouded in snow and frost. It is a moment of enormous misery for man and beast alike, when all the world looks dead and frozen. Imprisoned in the grasp was a chilly hell for the elderly and fragile. Particularly, winter was a season of dread defined by a despairing fear that the warmth would never return. Individuals heaped on every layer of clothes and cuddled together for warmth. Yet still, the cold creeped in. Flames sputtered and died in the moisture, leaving behind plumes of noxious smoke that burned the eyes and constricted the throat. Gasps and sniffles reverberated in the darkness, intermingled with the cries of the ill and dying. The cold retained its icy hold round the clock, converting exhalations to ice and chilling appendages. It appeared to approach chilly fingers into the chest, compressing the air and congealing the blood. Even the youthful and healthy moved as if through deep water, slow and yielding. There was no escape. Winter's grasp in the Middle Ages, no Florida getaways or comfortable electric blankets to take the edge off the cold, was a continuous ruthless friend, sapping vital energy essential for life. It's no, because the medieval world evaluated the passage of time, not in months or years, but in how many winters one managed to live. To make it through to another spring was a success, one that got more harder with each passing season. Yet nonetheless, despite the terrible circumstances, the widespread sickness, the gnawing hunger, and the life-snatching cold, the people of the Middle Ages suffered year after year. Cold after harsh winter, they shouldered on armed only in their stubborn spirits. As the last tiny stalks of sustenance ran low, they tightened their belts another notch until the fire burnt down to flames. They dragged another torn blanket near, and as the blackness rushed in from all sides, they nestled together and whispered prophecies of happier days to come. There is a touching part in the 14th century English poetry, Piers Plowman, that depicts the tremendous endurance of the medieval soul through grief and winter's bell, cold and snow and sleet and hail. All shall pass. When peace prevail, hope will triumph and never fail. Even in the darkest depths of winter, medieval people discovered modest pleasures and moments of grace. Neighbors shared what little they had with others who had considerably less. Among the cold and gloomy people, got together to sing and pray. At night, some claimed they could hear the voices of angels amid the raging winds, assuring that warmth and light will return again. And so the inhabitants of the Middle Ages hung tight to hope, clung firmly to life, and kept their eyes focused on the distant horizon where spring waited in wait. They knew in their bones that winter, no matter how cold and unyielding, was always a transient situation. The sun would return, the snows would melt, and the globe would be resurrected as verdant and magnificent as if winter had never arrived at all. All they had to do was survive and endure. They did with a strength created amid the very ice and stone of the season. The winters of the Middle Ages were terrible, unforgiving, and apparently forever. They brought starvation, sickness, ruin, and death. Yet they also brought forth the finest in the human spirit, the unbreakable determination to endure, to cling tight to hope, to come together in compassion and goodwill. The medieval world was tempered in winter's chilly furnace and emerged stronger for it, a bit tougher, a little wiser, with a bone deep respect for the turning of the seasons. So maybe we can draw a lesson from our medieval forefathers as we moan about scraping a few inches of frost off our windshields. For them, winter was a matter of life and death. A season should be endured with clenched teeth and unbreakable courage, and survive. They did, handing down to us their stories of winter's fury and the indomitable strength of the human spirit amid the darkness of our contemporary winters. May we recall their strength and find in it the motivation to shoulder through our own terrible days. The people of the Middle Ages confronted winter full in its frigid face and refused to submit. They braved floods and starvation, blizzards and blackest night. They buried their dead in cold earth and awakened to the cries of the starved. Yet always, always, they clung close to the promise of spring. And if they could make it through winter after winter with nothing more than faith and furs, then perhaps we can find the resolve to confront our own trials, knowing that the thaw will come and light will return. The severe winters of the medieval era may be long behind, yet their teachings resound through the years, a tribute to the eternal strength of the human spirit. Thus let us tread in the footsteps of our ancestors and face winter's cold with bravery, compassion, and unshakable hope, because if they could survive the darkest season with heads unbowed, then so too may we. Winter is approaching, but spring, as the medieval world knew so well, is never far behind. As the chilly winds howled over the freezing countryside, medieval peasants gathered around the flickering light of the hearth fire, snuggled close for precious warmth. They recounted stories of winters beyond those terrible and merciless seasons that tried the mettle of even the hardiest hearts in poor huts and magnificent palatial mansions alike. The sting of winter's chilly breath had no boundaries. Drafty shutters and flimsy thatched roofs gave scarce shelter from the harsh cold. From peasants to nobles, everyone felt the bite of Jack Frost nibbling at their faces and freezing their limbs. Yet others were lucky enough to have a raging fireplace around which to cluster. The crackling of the flames and the fragrance of smoking gave minimal consolation against winter's assault at the castles of the high-born Big Hall. Stoves devoured tremendous amounts of wood, accompanied by shivering slaves whose labors never ended. Yet even the mightiest noble trembled to walk beyond the fire's light, for winter's frost has a way of penetrating even the toughest stone walls and costliest furs. For those of humble birth, the season presented an exceptionally bleak and laborious fight for existence, their crude-hewn hovels boasting virtually little in the way of creature comforts. Scant rations of peat or wood scavenged from the forest barely fueled the spluttering fire. Families packed together in filthy confines, sharing body heat and inhaling air heavy with smoke and the fated stink of unclean people. It was a gloomy life, to be sure, and yet even in the midst of such privations, there were moments of brightness to be found. The warmth of community fires in the hamlet square attracted individuals out of their havils, if only for a little respite. Collected surrounding the leaping flames, neighbors swapped jests and jibes, tales and songs. For a short while, the harsh reality of winter appeared far away. Young couples sneaked secret kisses, their aurora undimemed by the cold. Youngsters yelled with pleasure as they scampered and slid over frozen ponds. Even the oldest felt the weight of their years lift, for a moment transported back to the carefree winters of their youth. Such interludes of merriment were all the more valuable for their scarcity. Winter's attack was merciless and unforgiving. Thoughts quickly shifted to empty tummies and the gnawing hunger that was the permanent companion of the impoverished hopes of spring's riches seemed a cruel farce as fields sat desolate under a covering of snow. The prospect of starvation loomed high in these lean times. A failing crop might bring catastrophe. For whole towns, many a mother watched anxiously, despair as her child's cheeks became pale and their eyes darkened with the lifeless glare of starving. The grim mathematics of lack fostered a particular type of desperation. Stories abounded of the depraved depths to which some would go to fill their stomachs, strange actions that haunted the dreams of devout people, because hunger was not the only evil that plagued the land. Winter's icy breath spawned a horde of maladies that preyed upon the weakening populace. The hacking cough of pneumonia rang through many a foe as loved ones stared on helplessly. The virus and flux raged, unrestrained, decimating whole families. The very elderly and extremely young were particularly susceptible, their weak bodies ill-equipped to survive winter's onslaught. Yet arguably the greatest cruelty was saved for those compelled to go out into the teeth of winter's wrath. Passengers risked life and limb on dangerous ice-licked roadways. Many an unlucky wayfarer met their demise, swept up by whirling blizzards or plunging into thick snowdrifts. Their frozen bodies would not be noticed till the spring, thaw a harsh reminder of winter's terrible power. Even the courageous, even the robust soldiers of the kingdom were not immune to winter's depredations. Clothed in their thick armor, they became easy victims for the bone-freezing cold that crept into every and rivet cold hands, rendered clumsy by frozen gauntlets, fumbled with sword and shield. Once powerful chargers floundered in the thick snowdrifts as icicles grew on their heaving sides. Huge and tiny alike cursed the name of winter in the corridors of power. The crown weighted heavily on royal brows, furrowed with care, because even a ruler could scarcely command the seasons to reverse their inexorable cycle. The expense of maintaining the court supplied with provender and firewood was astonishing. Royal coffers moaned under the strain as greedy merchants gained rich gains from the king's lares. But for all the horrors it created, winter's dominion was not endless. Even in the depths of frigid misery, peasants clung to the promise, celebrating spring's fresh regeneration. The celebratory feast of Stephen brought a pleasant relief from winter's difficulties. For one raucous day, the world flipped upside down as a humble peasant seized the mantle of the ruler of misrule. Drunken revelry and bawdy tunes boosted spirits and brightened hearts. Laughing that balm for the careworn soul reverberated across the frostbitten country. in the fullness of time, winter's gelled hold started to weaken. Icicles dropped from the eaves as the stronger light worked, its gentle, sparkling snow droplets, and crocuses forced their way through the softened dirt, delicate harbingers of winter's exit. The ground surged with fresh life, trembling from the torpid sleep of the winter months. Hearts soared and voices raised. Amid jubilant celebration, the feast of the plough honored the glorious homecoming of spring's green magnificence. Swift oxen pulled glittering plowshares through rich, dark ground when the cycle of planting and rejuvenation started anew. The lean seasons of winter quickly faded from memory as fields flowed with the green and golden wealth of the land. Gazing back over the generations, we marvel at the fortitude of our medieval forefathers. Year after pitiless year, they weathered winter's cruelties with stoicism developed of necessity. Their strength of character and unbreakable relationships of community were the key of their survival in the face of unspeakable struggle. They discovered pockets of optimism and moments of common humanity. So the next, whenever we whine about the inconvenience of a delayed trip or the indignity of slippery streets, let's stop and learn. Our present winter difficulties is simply a ghost of what once was in the fabric of human history. Our struggles of all ages needed. They serve as a reminder of our species, resiliency, preciousness, toasty home, full dream. As we drift off to sleep, let us spare a thought for those who are before. Our dreams, maybe the children glimpse of their worlds, a harsher, cruel world. And yet one in which the dawn and soul shine all the brighter for the darkness that surrounded us. Who knows? Wild spring breezes come. The frost of winter settled once again over the weary regions of the evil world, for the wretched peasants who ruled out a scant existence in the dirt, the very warm seemed to flee. Found chill, his bone, having nothing more than rags on their back, and stories, yet they knew not but shudder at sight of the dark scream just outside their doors. Fireplaces and stumps of wood coming together under the warmth of the flickering light. But the most, the sole consolation was the shared one those quarters that sleep, washed blood, on steam power, coffee, these terrible things that must have tormented them, wet, supplies, ending up alive on the other side, relentless rain, the highest born heaven, warm their thin furs with sumptuous feasts, not in frigid grip of the season. Castles, their lofty stone walls, enormous halls, like gigantic freezers, windows, flooring, down to the ceiling, the mightiest of blazing hearths to dispel evil. There are stories of royal winter hardships that make one cringe. In some time in the 15th century, Queen Elizabeth Woodville, consort of King Edward IV of England, was claimed to have literally frozen to death in her own rooms one exceptionally freezing night. Although records are hazy and highly inflated, one tale suggests that despite being swaddled in long robes with furs, the unfortunate lady succumbed to the terrible cold and was discovered in the morning, frozen rigid as a board. Whether the tale is accurate or not, It undoubtedly highlights the deadly nature of winter, for even the most wealthy monarchs and queens may escape the gnawing starvation and filthy circumstances of their low-born people. Yet in certain ways, the perils of the season were a great equalizer. After all, royals could no more command the elements than they could exist without air. The cold made its way into even the most magnificent of medieval sleeping rooms. And so, as the days got shorter, as the evenings grow darker and more chilly, the entirety of medieval civilization prepared itself for the yearly assault of winter's fury, from the lowliest crofter to the loftiest lord. A sensation of grim endurance appeared to settle about the people, a knowing that the only way out was via stocks of grains and salted meats were examined and rechecked, every bit of wood and kindling painstakingly saved, and thick woolen clothing awoke in solemn expectancy. The lone spark of levity and hope in the entire dreary situation came with the Christmas celebrations commemorating the feast of St. Nicholas on December 26th. For a few joyous days, the conventional social order was delightfully upended, as a lord of the rule was selected from among the peasants to head over a bawdy array of feasts, dances, games, and general fun, with tummies full of alcohol and wine cheeks reddened from the crush of people and the exertions of raillery. The simple people may for a short, brilliant moment forget the lengthy privations of winter and bask in the delights of life and community. One can image the sight of loud celebration bursting in halls and public squares over the nation, the raucous laughing, the wheezing of reed pipes and fiddles, as the people capered about in a swirling vortex of color and joy. For once waves and noblemen merged with the customary boundaries of class and position, eliminated in the spirit of friendliness and fraternity. The lord of misrule, possibly a puffed-up young peasant kid with lights in his eyes, made pompous proclamations and foolish directives to the thrill of all. It must have been a heady thing, that explosion of misrule and satinia among the bleakness. Just like with all things, the Christmas season was merely a momentary respite, the eye of the storm. After the Oul, wood burnt down to embers, and the final bowl was empty. The folks wandered back to their hearths, and the painful cold darkness once again descended the guy of St. Stephen's Day, and the lord of misrule's short, dazzling showers were replaced again by the hard task of life, as winter tightened its hold over the following long stretch of months. Time appeared to slow to a cold, but with the ground frozen and unusable, there was nothing for the rural people to do except bunker down and beg for deliverance. The decreasing days and increasing nights stretched like a wide gulf from which there was no, while huddled together in their rudimentary shelters against the terrible cold they must have despaired of, ever again feeling the kiss of spring's warm breath over their cheeks, because even the cruelest winter cannot stay forever, and certainly the first greening shoots of fresh life were already pushing up under the freezing earth, biding their time for those who survived, who clung to hope and to one other through the darkest days and coldest nights. The thaw would come. Again, the sun would return to the sky, the pulse quicken in the veins, the globe slowly shed its grays and whites for a blossoming flood of color. On plow, Monday, right after Epiphany, the ground might again be tilled, and the huge wheel of the agricultural year would creak back into action. The people would emerge, blinking into the dim but increasing light of spring, thinner and terribly worn, but alive and happy of it. Fields would be furrowed, seeds sown, flocks pushed out to feed on green grass, and the entire joyful dance of life would begin anew. Yet that was yet to come. For now, the merciless heart of winter pounded on, and the inhabitants of the Middle Ages steeled themselves once again to endure its cold downpour. They took what comfort they could from their scratchy woolen cloaks, their smoky hovels, their limited stockpiles of food, so meticulously laid by, but most of all from each other, in a world so afflicted by adversity and hazard. When the very season appeared, bent on squeezing the life from their bones, they survived, as they always got joined, nobles and peasants, young and old, shivering and hoping under the identical, lean winter sky, waiting for the spring that must sometime arrive. And so they huddled down in the darkness and the cold, listening to the melancholy howl of the wind and the groaning of the ice, telling what stories and creating what fantasies they could to beguile away the long winter evenings. Maybe they envisioned a future when the winters were gentler, the hearths warmer, the stomachs bigger, a world their trembling hands and chilled bones would construct for the years to come. Or perhaps they just held tight to what shreds of light and optimism they could conjure in the time, knowing that even the darkest winter must finally give to spring, in the face of such severe situations, the power of the human ability to persevere and have hope in better days ahead is certainly a miracle. One cannot not but feel a flood of respect for the bravery of our medieval predecessors, who confronted each harsh winter as an obstinate opponent and arose year after year to welcome the spring on the opposite side. Let us then lift our heads to those long ago rulers and peasants who suffered much and yet endured far more in our contemporary world of central heating. Considering on-demand food delivery, it might be easy to overlook the struggles they suffered as a matter of course. Yet as we slip off to sleep in our cozy beds, maybe we might spare a thought for those cramped medieval hordes and wonder at the tenacity that sustained them through winter after winter, waiting for the light's return. A world so often cold that is one, such resistant optimism, perseverance, swaddled chambers, like souls, what winter, as the long winter months on, the peasants look forward to their chance, improve their spirits, despite the trials. One such light of hope was the feast of Thanksgiving, observed each year in December, By the Middle Ages, it had become a treasured custom in most of Europe, after the serious religious observances of Christmas Day. St. Stephen's Day was a day for merrymaking, eating, and the playful reversal of usual social roles. Essential to the celebrations was the habit of misrule, when a peasant or commoner would be named Lord of Misrule for the day, and handed the ability to order their society's superiors. This light-hearted upending of the established quo gave a much-needed release valve for the tight class tensions that generally governed medieval existence. The Lord of Misrule presided over a topsy-turvy day of revelry, leading raucous processions around the streets, beginning malicious diversions, and decreeing that everyone from nobles to peasants should make merry, together skilled performers, like minstrels, jugglers, and jesters, would ply their professions, while games of chance and skill kept the spectators entertained. Bawdy comic skits termed mummers' plays were produced, reenacting events from tradition and folklore in broad, exaggerated strokes, Mimic jousts and pharisaical judicial hearings elicited peals of laughter, a pleasant respite from the gloomy reality of winter existence. Of course, no medieval celebration was complete without a nice feast on St. Stephen's Day. The Lord of Misrule may request that the affluent offer food and drink for the entire community, a benevolent gesture that promoted kindness and friendship. Among everyone, roasted meats were the focus of the feast, from geese and capons to the famous roast boar's head, marched in with tremendous fanfare, minced pork pies loaded with dried fruit. The spices gave a pleasant pleasure, while the wassail bowl ran freely, the warm spiced cider strengthening everyone's spirits. One can practically hear the laughing and energetic talk resounding through the corridors, soaring above the stormy winter winds outdoors. For one short, beautiful day, the challenges of winter melted into the backdrop as the community joined together in a mood of pleasure and fellowship. As the feast completed and the revelers scattered back to their hearths, they took the warmth of the celebrations with them like a flare of pleasant firelight in the dark, the assurance that they had friends and neighbors to depend on, that they could seeking moments of fun and lightness even in the bleakest situations, undoubtedly helped buoy their spirits for the hard days yet ahead, and somehow the winter's cold grasp looked a little less harsh. The roaring winds a bit more manageable when one had a tummy full of wonderful food and a heart full of camaraderie. The feast of St. Stephen was an opportune reminder that even the darkest gloom of winter will soon surrender to the first optimistic stirrings of spring. The delicate sprouts of fresh life started to hesitantly emerge as the winter snow retreated, as the frozen earth started to melt throughout the countryside. Alert eyes anxiously watched for the emergence of snowdrops, those courageous tiny flowers that forced their fresh green stems and exquisite white petals through the melting slush. Their appearance announced that the long darkness of winter was finally ending. As the season of renewal approaches in villages everywhere, tired folk cheered to witness the first signs of color and energy restored to a landscape that had been buried in freezing white stillness. After so many months, with a renewed bounce in their stride, medieval peasants returned to the rhythms of the agricultural year. The enormous wheel of existence starts to circle. Once additional hibernating cattle were moved out to meadows, beginning to green anew, as the farmer tied his crew to the plow, ready to churn the softened dirt. The first Monday after Epiphany, dropping 1st January, started to be known as Plow Monday. For this precise reason, it commemorated the point when the soil could be cultivated again, following the winter freeze, inaugurating the labors of a new farming season. Plows that had been put up for the winter months were pulled out and blessed in happy plow. Monday processions across the fields as plowmen went from house to door, collecting food ale and tiny money, all with anticipation of the effort and harvest to come. One may envisage a weather-beaten community crowded around their common plot, faces turned gratefully towards a sky lightening into a softer shade of blue. With hoes and digging tools in hand, they prepare to bury the first hopeful seeds into the receptive soil, an act of trust that spring will triumph, winter in due time. Among them is the wizarded elderly grandma, a youngster gripping each withered hand as she teaches them how to sow the peas, exactly like her own. Grandma had told her many long springs ago. The tiny kid chuckles with excitement as a rotunded earthworm wriggles away from the mud, while the elder gravely places each seed into its waiting empty. It was times like these that wisdom transferred from old to young, with growth sprouted afresh, that made all the privations of winter worthy. The sweet grin crinkling the grandmother's eyes carries the promise that the dark days are past, and life is returning to the earth once more, as the seeds snuggle into their clay homes, as the stronger light starts to coax green shoots from the ground. The specter, when winter eventually breaks its icy grasp and glides away, the pall of cold and death that lingered for so long, alleviated by a spirit of hope and regeneration, carried on spring's soft winds. Looking back from our present vantage point, it is depressing to think on the vast tenacity and endurance it must have needed to withstand the severe medieval winters year after year, with none of the facilities and pleasures we frequently take for granted. Their mere survival through to spring was an achievement worthy of awe, and nevertheless, in the face of great adversity, medieval people still managed to find reason for hope, joy, and celebration, the warmth of community, the promise of spring, the healing power of laughter and companionship. They were the lights that carried them through winter's deepest depths. Maybe as we cuddle closer beneath our comfy blankets, cozily sheltered from the cold, we could spare a thought for our long-ago forefathers. The next time the cold wind rattles our windows, as we moan at the cold, we could halt and grin, wryly knowing that our winter troubles likely pale in contrast to what they endured year after year, century upon century. And as we drift off to sleep, we may continue the understanding that we too contain an ember of that same indomitable summer that kindled in the hearts of medieval peasants, the conviction that spring always returns and life continues on, no matter how gloomy the winter night. So, as the final light fades and the breeze whispers a lullaby against the agony, I welcome you to let your mind roam back through the years, to walk beside those faraway forefathers as they conquered against winter's freezing showers. May their bravery and indomitable spirit influence your dreams tonight. And if this voyage via history has piqued your interest, I advise you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are always more dull stories to lull you into comfortable asleep. Till next time, my buddies, sleep well and think about toasty hearths and fresh green buds stirring under the snow. Good night.